And just like that, we have begun. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those joining around the world. We truly appreciate your time today. My name is Matt Bonk. I am a recruitment and admissions manager here for the DeGroote School of Business MBA programs. I oversee the recruitment for MBA, MBA with co-op, Accelerated MBA, and I do help with the blended learning part-time program as well. You are currently in attendance for one of our guest lecture series where we will be hosted by Professor Will Huggins. We will talk a little bit about finance and economics. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. Transcription is enabled, so if you'd like to see it on the bottom of your screen, please make sure you enable it below. This whole session will be recorded, so if you have any questions at all, or if you have to leave early, you can always look to come back to this because everyone who is registered will receive a recording. We will be overseeing the chat box function. However, during Professor's talk, please ask any questions specific to the lecture. If you have any questions about admissions or September 2022, we will be hosting breakout rooms after the lecture. So if you have any questions, so please refrain from asking any admissions related questions until after the lecture is done. Again, we will stop the recording and we will have breakout rooms for that. Okay, please make sure you are muted and you keep your video off at all times. There will be a question and answer period with Professor after the lecture has completed. Again, it's not just me though. Thank you so much for joining. We are a massive team looking to support all of our students across the board. We are led by our manager, Jen Dunk, who oversees all of our admissions and recruitment processes for our MBA programs. We do have 3 recruitment and admissions managers for the MBA, MBA with co-op, and Accelerated MBA. You may have spoken to Viviani, who is helping us with our blended learning part-time program. And if you are an admitted student, you may have seen or spoken to Ravina already, who is helping us with our retention efforts and getting students prepared for September 2022. This session is an awesome opportunity to see what it's like in our MBA program, albeit virtual. It is meant for anyone who is a prospective applicant, who is preparing their application, or who has already received admission and is coming in September 2022. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, One Plum Agreement. It is our shared responsibility to take care of the land, its resources, and all of the creatures within it. Again, without any further ado, I would love to introduce to our guest lecturer today, Professor Will Huggins. He is graciously given up his Thursday morning to help us a little bit and present a little bit more of a lecture. But before he begins, I would like to do an introduction. So Professor Will Huggins has been a lecturer with the DeGroote School of Business since 2018, teaches courses in finance, economics, statistics, and financial history in the MBA, Master of Finance, and undergraduate programs. Prior to this, he taught finance at the University of Toronto Rotman School of Business for 10 years. Where he delivered over 140 courses and has received numerous teaching awards. He has led international study tours on the history of finance in China, Italy, Germany, and the UK since 2013, and is deeply interested in the intersection of finance, history, and geopolitics, as well as the ethical issues related to the allocation of resources, all which is very, very present with the world around us as current state of affairs. Again, without any further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Will Huggins.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's nice to see a few, black square boxes first thing in the morning, as so often happens. So today, I was asked to give a short 25-minute talk to you on, quote, something interesting that would provide some insight and maybe generate some engagement. So I've decided on my topic that I would give a quick talk on what makes a country rich. Mostly because that's a sort of question, the answer to which is particularly valuable for us. If we could figure out exactly what aspects of human agency might generate the most meaningful impact for people's lives, we could most definitely make adjustments to the way that things are done in order to benefit more people. So my context for today is to try to understand what are the things that makes a country rich, makes a country well off, so that way we can try to perhaps import some of those lessons or export some of those best practices to others who may be able to modify these practices for their particular conditions and also improve their situations. So, taking a quick look at this to get started, I think the most useful place to begin a conversation about what makes a country rich is by actually understanding which countries are rich. And so this is a map from the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report. They publish this every year, and it gives us an opportunity to have a quick look at roughly how wealthy different countries are doing. In other words, to take a look at not just the total wealth of a nation, which obscures how many people live in that country, but specifically to take a look at the total wealth on a per person basis. And that gives us some indication about how well economically developed certain regions are over others. Now, you'll notice that, of course, there is pretty significant variation between nations. But in addition to that, we also have a lot of variation within nations. No one would imagine, for instance, that everyone in Canada has the same amount of wealth per person, or everyone in China has the same amount of wealth per person. It's sort of ridiculous. But if we add up all the wealth and divide it by the total number of people, it gives us an estimate about how well things are doing overall. Now, if we dig into the data a little bit more from the same report, what it does is it breaks down the information available by different regions, which allows us to try to understand that there may be certain systematic factors affecting certain regions, as opposed to simply assuming that wealth happens if you organize properly. There are almost certainly a number of systematic factors which will influence between group variation. And so our goal is to try to understand what those factors are that affect that between group variation and isolate from that things that humans can actually do something about. And so that's what we really want to focus on here. We want to try to understand what the lay of the land is effectively so that we can most properly navigate it. Now, when we start thinking about how to make a country rich, at the end of the day, there are a couple of key inputs. There is effectively the hand you're dealt, your geography and demographics, but there's also how you play that hand, right? Where we want to start to consider the different kinds of coordination systems that a society might use in order to navigate its resource challenges or its resource constraints. So when we think about a good hand being dealt to us as citizens of a country, generally what we're looking at is having access to fresh water, having agriculturally friendly temperate climate, plenty of natural resources, and hopefully some natural barriers which might be able to protect us from our neighbors if we don't happen to get along with them. Meanwhile, on the demographic side of things, what we're usually looking at is trying to understand how many workers are available in a particular country, not necessarily because we want to put everybody to work, but because there's a recognition that the people who aren't working are necessarily still consuming resources. And it might be important for us to consider how many resource producers we have versus resource consumers in a country. Because if the ratio starts to change dramatically and we have a lot more dependence than we do necessarily producers, then it's hard for us to generate surpluses necessary to truly become a wealthy country. Now, within the context of how one plays their hand, there are a couple of important things we need to consider. What we're really looking for are efficient systems that enable coordination of different kinds of specialists. It helps to reduce redundancy, it enhances predictability. So what are the two most important aspects of this? Number one, the law. We need an efficient and impartial dispute resolution system so that people are willing to put their money down for long periods of time and willing to potentially coordinate and work with total strangers with whom they don't have any sort of natural affiliation or trust. And secondly, well-designed financial institutions for coordinating people's efforts. A lot of people are familiar with the notion that good laws can help make a country rich, but not a lot of people think carefully about the idea that good finance is essential to making a country rich. And that's one of the ideas that I want to explore. So before we get into that in any kind of great detail, what I'd like to do is talk about what makes for good geography, what makes a good lay of the land, because we don't just want to pretend away that these factors, the hand you're dealt, don't matter. In fact, if we want to truly understand how well a country can manage, we do need to understand what it is that they're playing with. So the first thing for us to consider is how geography affects a country's national wealth. The first thing to consider is access to fresh water. Right? We want to know whether or not we've got the ability to irrigate cropland. We want to know whether we've got inland navigable water systems that we can use for shipping goods within the country. A lot of countries have river systems internally, but they're not always what we call navigable river systems, which means we can move large ships or barges up and down these rivers. Sometimes they're too shallow, they silt up, and they may become effectively large conduits for water, but not particularly for shipping. If we can get good rivers, though, that are navigable, they are an absolute godsend from an economic perspective because shipping by water is anywhere from 10 to 20 times cheaper than shipping by modern highway. So you can just imagine how much less expensive it is to ship by boat during the Bronze Age as opposed to, say, walking across a barren field. Even if we compare it to railroads, a much more modern innovation than, well, basic roads, we still find that water transportation is anywhere from 5 to 10 times cheaper than railroads, even once the railroads are in place and already built. So once we start to think about this, we understand that rivers are particularly important. In fact, throughout history, almost every civilization that's emerged that turned out to generate large states based their civilization around river systems, whether we're looking at the Nile or we're looking at the Danube or the Yellow River or the Ganges. We see over and over that civilizations tend to prop up around rivers. Another thing that comes up is access to oceans. Historically speaking, the ocean was effectively a wall, right? You could hug the coast, but the idea of crossing the open ocean wasn't a thing we really did until a few thousand years ago. And generally, there were very specific paths. When we start talking about, say, actively and regularly crossing the Atlantic or Pacific with large amounts of commercial cargo, that doesn't really happen until the last 400 or 500 years. And quite frankly, as it turns out, having access to the ocean has made a lot of countries fairly rich. Whereas access to the ocean system used to be interesting, and you would have merchants who might sail up to bring unusual goods. What we find is that today, having access to the ocean is essential for the economic survival of a country, simply because it allows them to connect to almost every other country which has ocean access. Now, also, looking at geography, we have to recognize that mountains make it really hard to maintain and build roads. They limit economic integration. They require a lot of investment in order for us to overcome the friction that they represent. Other aspects of geography that are important are things like rainfall, temperature, right? What is the latitude of your country? Do we have too much heat? Do we have not enough heat? If our country is very cold, we're going to spend an enormous amount of energy heating it. If our country is very warm, we'll spend an enormous amount of energy cooling it. And so what we're ultimately looking for are temperate countries, you might say, that have necessarily access to fresh water. And just automatically, those countries end up with significant advantages economically over countries that don't have it. The next major aspect is natural resources. Do you have arable land you can grow food on, or is most of the country a desert? Do you have, in the modern world, industrial energy supplies, things like coal, oil, uranium? Do you have critical metals like bauxite or copper that ultimately the modern world runs on? In addition to this, we have to recognize that geography often provides for economic or security. To some extent, your geography influences your country's security profile. It's easy to recognize that wars destroy both human and physical capital, and that in general, the less fighting that takes place in your country, the richer it will become over time. So ideally, a country's geography has what we would refer to as a hard shell that could protect it from advancing armies, things like mountains or oceans or enormous river systems. But we would want them ideally to have a soft interior with flat arable lands overlain by navigable rivers. Now, in terms of external security, the primary driver of external conflicts is usually resource competition. In fact, French economist Claude Frédéric Bastiat was famous for remarking that when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. So it's important to recognize that throughout history, trade has not only reduced the threat of conflict, but it's also contributed to growth by enabling access to non-local resources and facilitating knowledge transfers. Now, this is not to say that trade between nations prevents wars. People would recognize that in the lead up to World War I, for instance, that there was a great deal of economic integration between Britain and Germany, and yet they ended up fighting nonetheless. So it won't save you from any kind of conflict, but it might reduce the probability that such a conflict could occur. So let's take a quick look, for instance, at a map. I think it's always useful for us to take a look at things to really be able to put these kinds of lessons in context. So what I did here is I grabbed a basic terrain map of China. And you'll note that what we're looking at here is largely elevation maps and as well provides a little bit of a vegetation overlay. But what's most striking about this is that if you take a look to China's west and China's south, it's bracketed by the Himalayas and Tianshan Mountains, which gives it basically some serious natural defenses for anyone that might try to approach the country from the west or from the south. From the north, you basically have huge steppe lands and a massive desert belt, which means that there are actually very few invasion routes for attacking a country like modern China, allowing it to focus a lot more on economic development as opposed to necessarily security development. Now, looking at the map, we can see that most of China is fairly mountainous. In fact, a third of all of China's terrain is mountains. Another quarter of it is what we would call plateau, and another 10% of it is hills. Now, that leaves just about a third of China's available land for agricultural use. And unsurprisingly, most people in China live where there are large pockets of flat agricultural land. You can see up here when we take a look at a map of Chinese population density, that in these same large flat areas like the North China Plain happens to be where the overwhelming majority of people in China live. And so unsurprisingly, these are also the regions that are most economically dynamic. Now, as we mentioned before, the importance of rivers plays a major role in whether a country is rich. And China has three major river systems. Unfortunately, only two of these are actually potentially navigable. The Yellow River, which moves through the highland plateaus and then drains out here just north of the Shandong Peninsula, is a major river in China, but it unfortunately is so heavily laden with silt that it's not very easy to ship goods in and out using the Yellow River. The second river that runs through the center here is what we call the Yangtze River. The Yangtze River is navigable for a major portion of its depth, and you can sail up river almost 1,500 kilometers before you have to deal with smaller multimodal transportation like rail or trucks to be able to bring things to big ocean-bearing ships. But unsurprisingly, where the Yangtze empties into the sea at Shanghai, we also find another major center of economic development. And it gets even more than this. The last river that we have is the Pearl that empties out at Guangzhou and Shenzhen and Hong Kong, another major economic region in China. In fact, if we take a look at how the economy of China has developed in the last 45 years, you'll notice down here that it is those coastal regions, most notably those coastal regions which have access to inland river systems, which are the most economically dynamic in the country. Now, the next thing for us to consider are people or demographics. Generally speaking, a demographic country of a profile provides some useful information about its ability to mobilize capital for large investments. If you have a lot of working age people and not a lot of dependents, you'll generate a lot of surplus capital that you can use for investing in long-term projects that might add value to your society. On the other hand, if you have tons of children and tons of elderly dependents and not a lot of workers, then any surplus those workers generate is simply going to be used to feed people and to keep the lights on, let alone trying to advance society. Now, what we see here are what we call population pyramids. And what they're doing is they're counting the number of people, male and female, who fall into particular age categories. And this allows us to get an idea about how many people there are of different ages within a country. And seeing how the population pyramid changes over time can give us a lot of insight into what's going on with a country, economically speaking. So here you can see a change over a span of 100 years, where we've got Japan in the 1950s and a forecast from the UN of what Japan's demography will look like by 2050. You'll notice that by 2000, what had started to happen already is that Japan's traditional population pyramid had begun to hollow out. People were having fewer and fewer children. There was a bit more of a boom that occurs in the late 70s as Japan's economy is starting to take off. But once things bust in the early 90s, the number of children born just simply declines. And as you can see here from our estimates of the population, it doesn't come back. In fact, between 2000 and 2050, Japan is expected to lose something like almost 20% of its population. So not only is Japan going to have a shrinking population over the next 30 years, but Japan's population is also on average going to become much older. And this changes the dynamics of their economy. Typically, old countries not only have capital to lend, but they also have some of the most productive workers. If we consider Japan in the 2000s, we had a country that was producing substantial wealth because it had a lot of experienced workers, particularly these older workers with decades of experience, and only a reasonable number of dependents, both elderly and young, to have to manage. And this allowed Japan to generate some significant surplus. But Japan did not invest its significant surplus of the 2000s domestically. Instead, Japan invested that abroad. And so today, what we see is that Japan, as a relatively old country, has become a net international investor. Even though it has very little domestic growth, Japanese companies have made investments all over the world that are continuing to send their profits back to Japan, facilitating an economy that can support all of these elderly people. Now, typically, when we look at young countries, those are the demography Japan had in the 1950s or even before that, we typically see that these countries are in debt. They're countries that have borrowed to invest or consume today on the promise of a lifetime of future productivity of all of these young workers. Now, this of course is dependent, their dream is sort of dependent on the notion that people will survive and become these workers. But at the end of the day, usually what we observe is that young countries are net borrowers and old countries like Japan or Germany are net lenders internationally. Even China is going through this particular transition now as China moves to being one of the older countries in the world and has generated a significant international portfolio to invest in. Now, it's worth noting that many people often see elders as being just a simple economic cost, but this is not necessarily true. It's not that as soon as people turn 65 years old, they suddenly become a burden on society. Even if that was economically true, it would be morally weird for us to consider things in that way. So from a purely economics point of view, maybe we should be thinking rather than how do we support elderly people, and in turn, flip the question and say, what can our elders do to continue supporting themselves? Are there ways that we can make work more viable or more balanced for people in their 60s who may want to be able to continue as a knowledge worker? It's one thing to expect, someone who has worked in a lumber yard their whole life to continue working after their mid-60s. But someone who has a soft typey job like I do could very easily continue to work well into their 70s, quite frankly. So in that sense, we have to try to think of other ways that we can change not just the structure of work, but people's perceptions of the elderly. Because as you'll note here in this diagram that maps out Canada's elderly and childhood dependency ratios, Canada is having fewer and fewer children, and our youth dependency ratio is in decline. Nonetheless, our senior dependency ratio is on a huge increase. And so you'll note that during this period where we had a declining number of dependents per worker, that Canada generated some wealth. Most people would regard the 1970s as a pretty good time economically in Canada. And our country did gather substantial amounts of steam economically until that dependency ratio started to rise again in the last decade. And now what we have to look forward to is a continuing increase in the dependency ratio. However, what's important to note is that we are switching the composition of our dependents. Whereas before we used to have many children, in the future we will have many elders. And that may mean making switches from, say, schools which develop the quality of our young Canadians to switching to later stage education so that way our elders can stay more economically active. There are a few different consulting reports that the German government had commissioned to try to understand what it could do to help overcome this kind of demographic inversion where they have fewer children but many elders, because this is a serious problem in Germany. They're several years ahead of Canada on the timeline and a lot closer to what Japan's experience is. And from among those consulting agencies, there were a couple of key selections that were identified as things that could be focused on. For instance, Deutsche Bank advised the German government that in operational work, older employees could be slower, but that they often made up for that with fewer mistakes, so that overall they were actually no less productive once we factored in error count. If they had teams with just old people, they argued it would be too slow. If they had teams with just young people, they'd make too many mistakes. And so Deutsche Bank actually suggests that what is optimal is getting a blend of old and young workers together. Mercer says that it seems the contribution of older workers materializes in increased productivity of those around them. So this gives us some idea that we may have to simply rethink how it is that we make use of our elders in society so that we can overcome the kinds of perceptions where we are simply having fewer and fewer workers supporting more and more retirees. If any retirees can still remain economically active, then we can take advantage of that, and it can help us to reduce this overall dependency ratio that will reduce the amount of capital we have for investing in our future. Now, now that we've had a chance to talk a bit about the hand that you're dealt, it's worth talking about how people play that hand, because we have a pretty good understanding of the macroeconomic factors that either enhance the opportunities for countries to do well or impede them, right? Countries can have bad geography, countries can have bad demographics, but what do you do if that's your country? For instance, Japan traditionally has absolutely terrible geography. They lack natural resources for the industrial age. 90% of the country is mountains. They can't feed their own population with domestic food production. And this creates some significant issues. Nonetheless, you'll notice that Japan is one of the wealthier countries around the world, and that's because they've been very, very cautious about how they've made investments in enhancing productivity. So looking at a famous macroeconomic model from the 20th century, what's called the Solow growth model, we see that economic growth is really driven by three factors. There's more capital, basically more equipment, more stuff. There's more people, which allows us to have tighter degrees of specialization. And of course, better know-how. In other words, better coordination systems for this capital and for these people. So at the end of the day, the key thing for us to focus on, if we're not just talking about the hand we're dealt in terms of capital and resources or people that we have available, we need to think about productivity, how we organize people. And there's a couple of key inputs to productivity. The first of these is the role of law. Impersonal parties trying to coordinate effort and exchange often need some kind of recourse to an impartial authority who can adjudicate their claims in a quick and low-cost manner. This could be a village chief, could be religious scholars, could be military strongmen, could be even a professional jurist. But what's important is that clear rules and effective enforcement help to regulate economic behavior and might actually even preempt some disputes in the first place if the outcome is obvious ahead of time. One of the particular areas that's useful in this is the British common law that we've seen developed and transmitted around the world, which is largely based on precedent. The reason precedent is so useful is because it allows people to understand how a particular conflict will get resolved without having to call on a judge. Now, on that note, it's useful to understand just how important access to justice is for creating good economic outcomes. Historically, one of the problems that we had was that even if you could seek recourse from the state, say by appealing to state courts in Bronze Age Hammurabi's Babylon, you would still have to travel to a place where you could find a professional jurist, and it would cost a lot of money and a bunch of time to get your dispute resolved. Interestingly enough, things changed somewhat in the 7th century CE with the revelation of the Quran. A scholar from the University of Chicago, Marshall Hodgson, argued in his 3-volume book, The Venture of Islam, that the inclusion of a commercial code of conduct in Sharia law actually helped to encourage the religion's adoption among traveling merchants who otherwise had to resort to slow, difficult courts that were only found in major cities. Now, what was interesting is that these same merchants then carried this new creed with them from conquered cities to remote oases, helping the religion itself to spread. But one of the major reasons that this religion spread was not simply conquest of major cities, but because the merchants adopted it. And the merchants largely adopted it, in Hodgson's view, because it provided a dispute resolution system whereby any holy man or any Qadi in a small oasis or a small town could act as a judge to resolve commercial disputes. And if all merchants in a particular region adopted this same code of Islamic conduct, then they would be able to predict how each other might behave, and it would be easier to contract with people who had similar views. Now, in addition to simply preemption of commercial disputes and access to justice, one of the areas in particular that is of notable value in terms of creating economic success is the notion of private property and legal protection of that private property. It's been shown over the years to encourage entrepreneurship and other forms of private economic activity. However, civil strife, corrupt state actors, and criminal elements can obviously make property less secure and thus impede investment. So it becomes important for us not just to think about external security in terms of generating wealth, but also internal security for people who might potentially invest in our society. Next, we have to look at the role of finance. And finance is absolutely essential to creating good economic outcomes for people in various countries around the world. The better we can organize finance, the wealthier we're all going to be. So as important as courts and laws might be, my personal focus is on trying to understand the basic plumbing of exchange in order that we use to try to coordinate the flow of efforts and resources. Because the goal ultimately is to try to improve those tools for allocation, improve those tools that we use to coordinate. Because every time we improve coordination, every time we get a little bit more efficient with our allocation, we produce a little bit more economic surplus. And that surplus can be used to improve people's standard of living. Now, we know that concentrating resources, by concentrating resources, that financial tools and organizations tend to create opportunities that are otherwise unavailable if people had to operate at small individual scales. By pooling our resources together in, say, things like insurance companies or even states or in pension plans, we find that we can do a number of things which would otherwise be impossible for individuals in an atomized economy. We can build infrastructure that pays for itself later on. We can insure against natural disasters in some parts of the country by spreading risk across all of the citizens. We can create cultural, educational, and religious endowments that survive for centuries and continue to provide support for the things that we find add value to society. Now, unfortunately, pooling resources like this, whether we're talking at a bank or a stock exchange or a pension plan, ultimately creates an interesting problem related to allocation, what we refer to in economics as the principal agent problem. In the PA problem, what happens is that the agent ends up acting according to their private interests rather than those of the principal that provided the resources. And this means, for instance, that we can have a situation where we have made deposits to the Bank of Montreal expecting that they will be prudently lent out to worthwhile investments, but instead could be, for instance, lent to insiders of the corporation, as happened in 1875 when Bank of Montreal president George Stephen absconded with $8 million from the Bank of Montreal's treasury, used it to speculate on a bankrupt railroad with his cousin Donald Smith, and when they were successful with their speculation, put the $8 million worth of capital back into the Bank of Montreal's vault, claiming that no harm, no foul, because things had worked out okay. Obviously, people would have felt much differently if George Stephen's speculation had blown up in his face. And so it's important for us to think carefully about how we arrange our financial institutions to limit these kinds of risks that might happen when we give discretion over allocation to specific managers. We need to make sure that the right kinds of incentives and rules are put in place so that way we can ensure that allocation of resources by these specialists actually just leads to better outcomes for people. Now, when we start thinking about why it is that we should pay attention to these things, why should we care about finance, why should we care about history? Well, let me put it in different terms. We don't particularly care for economics or finance. Let's just say that over the grand sweep of history, the surpluses created by finance in periods of financial innovation often result in surges of cultural products, as artisans are afforded more resources during the good times. We see this in classical Greece, we see this in Song China, we see it in Renaissance Italy, we see it in 20th century America. And so perhaps one of the best ways to understand why we need to do finance well is presented to us by the second president of the US, John Adams. He said, "I must study politics and war, that our sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. But our sons must study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain." So the key thing here for us to realize is that as long as we do finance better, we can actually make life much more interesting and much more worthwhile. So hopefully this has provided you with a little bit of inspiration to try to continue the work of other people who came before us and try to help us make better versions of finance. Because by building better finance, we've been able to do a number of amazing things. Over just the last 100 years, we've created things like national pension plans. We've been able to create broadly diversified insurance portfolios that allow people to hedge different kinds of risks. These are the sorts of things that our Bronze Age ancestors would have dreamed of. And yet here we are in the 21st century, making use of their ancient technologies in more sophisticated ways and creating a kind of world that they would have only dreamed of. Now, if you're at all interested in exploring this topic any further, it just so happens that I teach an elective, which explores how and why certain developments occurred in the history of our modern financial toolkit. Each week in that class, what we do is we examine a different type of financial organization or technology. We consider its development through to the modern age and how change has affected those who used that tech. For instance, this semester, the way it's organized pedagogically is that students are watching videos and reading notes ahead of class, where we spend most of our live class time discussing related prescient questions on each type of organization or technology, such as how to improve the payments architecture or build pensions that can resist the sort of demographic inversion I warned about earlier this morning. The learning experience in that course doesn't require memorization or even calculation, frankly, but students are expected to collaborate on their case studies that end up in highlighting important turning points in Canadian financial history. This year, we're talking about the Bank Act of 1871, the land surrender of the Hudson Bay Company, and the collapse of Confederation life in the 1980s. The idea here is to try to understand what were the major events that led to these, and what are the major implications of these turning points in history, so that we have a better idea of how we can tackle the challenges of the 21st century. Because there are often lessons from the past that we can harvest to build better solutions for the future. Maybe I'll see you there in 3 years. Anyways, that wraps up my talk for this morning. Hopefully this has been interesting to you, and yeah, I'll look forward to answering any sort of questions you might have about this.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. Was very fast and effective. Well done. Really appreciate it. We already have some questions coming in. So Raphael, you raise your hands. You can certainly unmute yourself and ask your question aloud. Or you can type into the chat box, either way. Okay.
Yeah, I noticed Ravina had her hand up too, actually. Did you have a question?
Hello.
Oh, hey, Rika. All right, we'll run with you first.
You said something earlier on about the use of the youth and other people in boosting the economy of the country, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch most of your question. I just heard that we were looking at youths in the economy. I missed some of it, what you said. Okay.
You said something about using the youths, that's the younger people and the older ones.
Right? Yeah, it's much harder for us to it's much harder for us to make younger people economically viable, say like making 10-year-olds work. Most of the time we tend to think of those sorts of things as irresponsible. And in the modern industrial world, we actually find that people end up needing almost 15 years of training before they're economically viable. Like we start training kids at 5 and generally they don't pay taxes until they're at least 20. So the idea is not so much that we can make youth more useful, but we might want to make sure that once they reach adulthood, that they are more productive. And of course, that means investing in education. Right? I know it sounds kind of hokey because I work in education and I'm suggesting that more money should flow to education. But nonetheless, this is a macroeconomic fact. We take a look, the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics went to the endogenous growth theory of Paul Romer. And Romer's theory, you might appreciate this, actually suggested that a good part of productivity happens because of the externality associated with education, which is to say, once I figure out how to do something, I teach you how to do it, and you don't have to figure it out from scratch. And once you know how to do it, you can teach your friends and family how to do it without them having to figure it out from scratch. So in that sense, if we can provide better education, we can have much more better equipped 20-year-olds showing up to the workforce.
Okay, I've got some other questions to ask. I'm sorry, I hope you'll be able to answer. You know, in some countries, we have some levels of uneducated youths. So how do we make these youths that are uneducated to be useful to the society?
That's tricky. Being able to say, how do we turn uneducated people into people who are useful to society? One, I would generally argue that all humans have value, not just in terms of their emotional connections to one another, but simply in terms of human capital. Even if I strip off all the feelings and everything that makes us human, every human is actually economically valuable and productive, strictly speaking. And every human life lost is a loss of potential value for us. Now, that said, how we coordinate those people is important. If we can't invest in education, then the next most important thing becomes, how do we get people to say, work together collectively? And that can involve even something as simple as, say, unionizing a workforce, so that way individual workers don't face a monopsony situation of trying to negotiate with a powerful employer. This way, we might have workers who have better ideas about how to get the job done, providing that information uphill as opposed to simply being dominated by local bosses. So there are different ways we can organize things that improve coordination without necessarily always just enhancing the human capital of people. Sometimes it's just a matter of, how do we organize better? Should the boss be able to just fire anybody from the mine site at their whim, or should there be some kind of process in place for determining who should or shouldn't be fired? If we have a process, it protects us against that principal agent problem where bosses just fire people they don't like. So that's one advantage we could look at.
Okay. I think that's the questions I have for today's session. I so much appreciate you. Thank you.
Great. Just a couple of questions in the chat really quick. Someone had asked, how is climate change influencing national wealth, or is it too early to see the impact? I guarantee that it's easy to see. Right? Certain places are going to be affected by this. For instance, Indonesia is already having to move its capital city of Jakarta off of the island to another island, simply to make sure that the capital city isn't constantly flooded. So climate change has very big impact. Some countries like the Maldives may simply disappear in the next 100 years, overtaken by the Indian Ocean as ocean levels rise. Meanwhile, if we take a look at countries like, say, Canada or Russia, which traditionally have a lot of frozen land, we actually expect to see the agricultural frontier move north. So as weird as this sounds, and I realize it will be contentious to say so, Canada may be in a position of winning from climate change, frankly. The Northwest Passage could open and become ice-free. We could develop a lot more agricultural land, and territories further north may become more and more economically viable. So what the future holds is obviously uncertain and obviously unclear. We're not quite sure how ecological cascades resulting from climate change could play out negatively for Canada. But on the basics of simply looking at temperature, we may actually end up with more usable territory at the end of the day. And that makes things rather complicated. So if you wonder why Canada drags its feet around climate change initiatives, part of it is because we have oil economy out west. Another part of it is because we're otherwise slated to win, which means that people in Canada don't feel a strong necessity to solve this problem before their cities disappear. It's not felt as pressingly in Canada as it is in countries like, say, Indonesia. Mohammed asked, what is suggested for the Afghan economy from our perspective? That's really tricky, quite frankly, because there are a lot of interesting problems in Afghanistan. Afghanistan does have some good geographic endowment in terms of mineral resources, and it is ringed by mountains, which should make it very hard for anyone to invade overland. But by the same token, they also have very, how do I say, inefficient economic structures internal to the country, even in terms of the money transfer system. Whereas here we're used to using things like Interac or even Apple Pay or Google Pay. The primary system for money transfer in Afghanistan is a system called Hawala. That's been around since about the 8th century, quite frankly. It emerged in Central Asia, but Hawala ultimately does not have the kind of recourse if somebody happens to rip you off. It runs very much on a notion of trust and honor, but there are very few safeguards in place. And as a result, it can be challenging to, say, pool the money of 10,000 or 100,000 people in Afghanistan into a project using a tool like Hawala. So the problem Afghanistan faces right now is that it doesn't have a good system for coordinating the pooling of resources. And I'd say that's their primary thing that holds them back. Even though there are a number of Islamically compliant or Sharia compliant financing structures, Afghanistan is finding that it doesn't have any friends internationally for the most part, and is therefore having a hard time attracting the capital it's going to need to rebuild the country after 40 years of civil war. So it's hard to say what Afghanistan needs, but I would say for sure what they need is peace. And they need a lot of time to just sort of rebuild things and get back on their feet. Otherwise, my other advice for Afghanistan, if you cut women out of your workforce and out of your education system, Afghanistan, you're going to be poor. Simple as that. Justinia asked, what's the name of the course? It's the History of Finance. Interestingly enough, a bunch of the lectures I put up on YouTube if you're interested in having a look at that, because, well, in Canada, instructors own their own IP. And I thought that this was useful enough information that everybody should want to have a look at it. So you can find me on YouTube and have a look. Okay, Jade asked, what would you say about poor governance in a country's economy? I was going to spend some time talking about the impacts of corporate governance and financial institution governance, but I only had 20 minutes. In general, what we find is countries that have poor external governance systems tend to have lower prices for equity. In other words, what we see is internationally, institutional investors will actually pay a premium for good corporate governance. And that premium is much higher in countries that have poor rule of law. For instance, in Canada, the premium for good corporate governance as of a couple of years ago was roughly 10, 12%. In Russia, that same premium was 40%. Why? Because Russian firms weren't required to offer, say, things like quarterly statements, and investor protections were substantially poorer. So if companies were creating internal governance systems to compensate for the lack of external ones, investors were willing to pay for those. So it does make a big difference. If you have poor governance at the end of the day, not just political governance, but economic governance, you're just going to end up with a bunch of kleptocrats robbing people, making themselves rich, and then probably claiming that it was the fault of outsiders that people are poor. Now, Raphael asked, in some countries, we've got lesser workforce. Okay, that was your earlier question. Savi asked, can a country increase its productivity only based on trade? what trade will do for you is not increase your productivity, but it may allow you to market the thing that you do better. And that will allow you to generate surplus capital that you can invest in things that become more productive. So for instance, if we look at China over the 1980s and 90s, China had a massive surplus of very cheap labor, which it used to create export products that generated profit. Those profits were reinvested into education, healthcare, and infrastructure systematically over the last 40 years. China's economic growth is not some kind of miracle. They literally bought a macro textbook and followed the instructions in the manual. It wasn't very hard to do. In fact, a lot of countries could do that. Weirdly enough, in 2018, my Master's of Finance students in my economics class pooled some money, and we bought an economics textbook and we sent it to the president of Turkey, because he seemed to have an unusual idea that cutting interest rates was going to reduce inflation, which is the exact opposite of how it works. So maybe we can help out. I don't think he read the book though, because quite frankly, he's been doing exactly the opposite since 2018. So can you increase productivity on trade alone? No, but trade can give you the fuel you need to start that self-fueling productivity fire. If you can trade your way into a little bit of surplus resources, you can invest that in hospitals. You can invest that in ICT technology, internet communications, telecom. You can invest that into education. You can invest that into economic infrastructure. So trade helps. It gets you started. That's why the IMF often pushed countries to try to generate surpluses from trade so that they'd have money to invest domestically. Richard asked, do you have an insight over which systems of government are more effective or productive from an economic standpoint? This is an interesting question, which is obviously up for interesting debate right now. Historically, we've found that totalitarian governments generally have very poor economic outcomes, mostly because they lack the information that is necessary to optimize. Right? Historically, that's been the problem. The emperor decides what you need or what you don't need, and simply organizes the country around that. So the problem was that ultimately they didn't have information. And we see that in the central planning failures of the early 20th century. Like the Soviet economy, garbage. And that's an easy way to understand, is that people did not generate demand necessarily that was being met. You had a top-down command economy, which didn't really pay attention to what it was that people were looking for specifically, and as a result, generated substantially less innovation. So authoritarian governments have a hard time with innovation, because oftentimes they capture any gains from it so that way they can profit from it, as opposed to entrepreneurs. That's one of the major problems with authoritarian regimes. But things may be turning in the favor of authoritarian regimes, I hate to say. One of the issues is that in the 21st century, we can get a massive amount of granular level information about people's consumption habits and the things that they buy on a regular basis. And therefore, given massive AI and our 21st century computing power and all the information generated by people's use of devices, central planning might actually become more possible than it has been in the past. And what we've seen is the People's Bank of China, for instance, focusing monetary policy in a targeted way in the last couple of years, as opposed to using blanket tools like lowering interest rates for everyone. Instead, they would provide targeted stimulus to specific parts of the economy. Now, economists are studying this, but the jury is still out on whether such targeted monetary policies are actually going to be effective. So to answer your question, we know what influences the result, but we don't actually know the final answer to that. So anybody who tells you that totalitarian regimes are definitely better, well, is, how do we say, skipping ahead of the analysis. And similarly, anyone who tells you that a democratic governance system is going to produce the most value is also skipping ahead of the analysis. Let me see what else we got. How would you explain Russia's current action knowing its negative economic impact? That one's really easy. It's the map. If you take a look at the map and you strip off all the countries on the map, and you realize that Moscow is basically sitting in the middle of a field surrounded by a forest to its north and its east, you realize that there's a big geographic problem. The fact is that from Paris to Moscow, it's flat. And that's basically been an invasion superhighway for centuries. In the last 250 years, Russia has been invaded 4 times from the west. Sweden, then the French, and then by Germany twice. So Russia's in a really kind of challenging situation in the sense that it's been attacked from the west a bunch of times. Now, I'm not going to make some garbage argument about NATO is creating this problem, because that's a lie. Anyone who understands how security works knows that that is not the situation. However, looking at geography and demographics, Russia is collapsing demographically in the same way that Japan and Germany are. And the estimate is that 20 to 30 years from now, Russia will just simply not have enough soldiers to be able to defend its borders. 25 years from now, Russia will have 2 soldiers where today it has 3. And if you're trying to defend a giant open border in the middle of a field with no natural defenses, you're spread thin. So Russia's objective here, at the end of the day, if we strip off everything else, is to anchor their western border at the Carpathian Mountains. You want to take my bet? They're going to eat Moldova too. Why? They're going to push to the Carpathians. They're going to try to block at the Bessarabian Gap, and they're going to try to block at the Polish border, because those create smaller pinch points for them where they can mass troops to prevent invasions. That's what I think is going to happen. That's why I think it's happening. That's why I don't think Russia is going to stop this invasion unless they are necessarily forced to in some way, unless the Russian people remove their support from their government in that sense. There's a very good geographic and demographic argument for why Russia is making this play and why they're making it right now. Let me see. To what extent will today's financial technology innovation impact the history of finance? It'll probably be awesome. Why? Because at the end of the day, it helps us with quantification. Quantification helps us to be more precise in our allocations. And the big advances in finance over the last 150 years have largely been married to advances in quantification. In fact, the big advances in finance over the last 400 or 500 years stemmed from advances in statistical sciences and economic sciences. So when we start being able to crunch the math using computers, one of the things that happens, for instance, is that trading costs go to 0, that all of a sudden it becomes easy for people to invest in a very broad, diversified portfolios. So at the end of the day, I think today's technology is opening up a lot of new vistas and new potentials for ways to apply the basic kit of finance in a number of different ways that will create new opportunities for us. I think that computers reduce barriers and reduce frictions that otherwise prevented us from organizing in those ways. Okay, lots of questions. Let me see. It says, in countries where we have a high level of unemployment and older age people who are not willing to retire to give young ones opportunity to grow, what's the future of this country? Well, this statement of old people aren't retiring to give young people a chance is predicated on the notion, which is mythology, incidentally, that there's only a fixed amount of work to do, that there's only so much work that the whole country needs to do, and that we can't possibly find anything else for anyone to do. This is problematic. Like, the place we normally see this encountered is in academia, where people say that old professors won't retire to make room for new professors. This is a bit of a tired saw, but it really hinges on the idea that if we don't have enough space in certain universities, there are more universities. Maybe, right, that we should be thinking in terms of how do we expand the use of all of the people with the skills we have, as opposed to thinking our country only needs to do, 100 hours of work and we have too many people for that, so a bunch are automatically unemployed. Why don't we do more? So strictly speaking, unemployment may be, to some extent, a bit of a failure of imagination. What else can we do with these people? Even if we pretend that we are state-level emperors and we have all this unemployment, can we not find useful things for people to do? Even if we don't have money to invest in education, are there ways we can organize them to do things like perhaps providing a little bit of better infrastructure support? Perhaps we can organize people around simply repairing damaged things or things which have worn down in our society. In general, if you have a lot of old people and a lot of unemployment and you don't have money to educate your people, the future of that country will be more challenging. I don't want to say grim because it's not a guaranteed death sentence by any stretch of the imagination. You just have a hard hand to play. And therefore, you have to be a lot more cautious about what investments you make to ensure that they ultimately have a big impact. When you've got a bad hand to play like Japan, you have to play it right.
Professor, to be respectful and conscious of time, would you have sufficient time for the next, say, 2 questions in the chat box?
Yeah, I can hammer out a couple of questions. If anybody's got any further questions about this sort of stuff, email me. I'm easy to find. I'll put my email address in the chat for you. Please don't sign me up for stupid mailing lists or whatnot. But if you've got more questions about this stuff because you're interested, by all means, hit me up. I'm a special kind of nerd who likes to talk about this all day long. So this way I don't boil over the time too much. But let me see if I can field another question or 2. Let me see. According to that quote on John Adams you put on the slide, so which would you recommend to study and promote as a nation? The starter in order to recover from financial crisis would be in politics and history, or finance and politics? I would tend to say that we don't just have one person running a country. So it would be, if we have a lot of people, we should be focusing on understanding politics. We should be focusing on understanding mathematics and engineering. We should be focusing on understanding agricultural systems, understanding architectural systems, understanding financial systems. Because you'll notice in the John Adams quote, the very first thing is really about security, politics, and war. The second stage is about economics. It's about creating that surplus once we're stable. And the third part is about spending that surplus on something that makes life worthwhile. Because nobody is going to tell you that life is worthwhile because of investment bankers. But if you're clever, you might realize that investment bankers help to generate that surplus that pays for all those artists that we enjoy. So in a roundabout way, doing finance better actually does make us all much better off. But in general, there is an order of operations. If you don't have security, you don't do economics. And if you don't have economics, you don't do art. Last question. Aman asked, many corporations today are running after maximizing profitability or productivity at the cost of environment and mental health of employees. How do we ensure growth is sustainable and inclusive? This one is super easy. We just choose differently, right? If we decide that we are interested in taking a lower rate of return on our investments on a risk-adjusted basis, but that we're going to have, say, happier people or less environmental degradation, then that's just something we'll have to deal with. The idea that we have a problem here stems entirely from the fact that people want to make as much money as possible for as little risk as possible, and yet somehow do good. The truth is that you have to accept that you're not going to generate as much profit from this if you're going to do good. Or if you want to organize things a la Milton Friedman, where corporations just focus on maximizing profit, then the responsibility falls to the individual to use those profits for good. Now, that said, you might say, well, I made an extra $1 in profits from RBC this year because they focused on profit maximization. What am I supposed to do with my $1 extra? Well, to those people, I would remind you that there is a lot of things we can do at the micro level. And if we all pull a little bit, we can move a very big block of stone. Okay, so we're rolling on to 10 o'clock. And like I said, I'm happy to field any questions or, meet with people over Zoom, give you a little bit more insight into the program and what you can expect. But we are running out of time. So hopefully this has inspired you to come and join us at DeGroote so we can talk more about these kinds of questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. And again, some students have already admitted, they're already here, they're already excited for your P703 lecture, F703, whatever the actual breakdown is. But again, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate giving the full hour, giving this wonderful breakdown of finance, economics, and what makes a country rich. We truly appreciate your time today. For those, if you do have questions for Professor Huggins, please send him an email. And again, do not add him to any sort of list he's not looking forward to. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. Before everyone leaves, I will like to just finish off real quick by saying, if you do have any questions, any admission related questions, we will be opening breakout rooms with Ravina, our retention officer, and myself for any admission specific questions. Any questions at all, you can always send us an email to mdinfo@mcmaster.ca. Please follow us on social and definitely look to check out our Building a Digital Community podcast by our very own student ambassador, Chirag Sheth. Again, this is the end of the recording. Thank you for everyone joining today. And thank you, Professor Huggins, for giving your time. Have a great rest of your week.
Take care, everyone.